Generally speaking, cemeteries are classic and without history, but if you do the right research, you'll find that some are far from commonplace and that surprised by their originality. Others are even frightening, tragic, or comical. Some cemeteries do not look at all like simple funeral spaces. These places exhibit unique and unlikely elements that attract tourists and the curious. This diversity of cemeteries stems from very ancient cultural rites, which honored the dead and already practiced burials like the Neanderthals and the ancient Egyptians. Hold on tight. We will show you the most fascinating and strange cemeteries. These are the 7 strangest cemeteries in the world. Let us go to northern Iowa, in the United States, where there is a strange cemetery that feeds a lot of disturbing rumors. If you are easily frightened, or if you are superstitious, it would be best to avoid the Oakland Cemetery. It's a creepy place. Its particularity is that it contains a frightening statue of a black angel, 2.5 meters high and more than a century old. Here is a brief history of this monument, which spread fear among Iowa City residents and almost inspired a horrific feature film in 2013. Midwife Teresa Feldovert and her son Edward left Czechoslovakia and settled in Iowa City. Her young son died tragically in 1891 and is buried in the local cemetery, Oakland Cemetery. After this tragedy, Teresa moved to Oregon where she married Nicholas, who in turn died in 1911. She then decided to return to Iowa City, where the ashes of her late husband would be laid to rest. But, by a strange inspiration, the widow Teresa commissioned a statue from the Czech-American sculptor Mario Korbel. Indeed, he made her an unusual bronze statue, under which her husband's ashes will be placed. But this statue does not have the usual shape of an angel, with wings spread out and his head raised as if he is ready to take the flight to heaven. No, the statue is dark and inspires a feeling of affliction and even terror. Also, the angel in question is looking down at the ground and its original color has darkened due to oxidation. This sculpture, which has become a local attraction, has inflamed the imagination. During Halloween, young locals gather around the statue to unravel the unsolvable mystery of this frightening angel. In the cemetery of Roermond in the Netherlands, there is a grave that is both touching and sobering. In this cemetery, which is divided into 2 parts, Catholics and Protestants do not mix, as a separation wall has been put between them. It was forbidden for relatives of the deceased and those of opposite denominations to lie side by side. At that time, in the 19th century, the Dutch regime was based on religious segregation, where Catholics, Protestants, and Jews lived in isolation, according to their customs. Yet Jacob van Gorkum, a Protestant, and Josefina van Averden, a Catholic, fell in love with each other. Together they braved social disapproval and got married. Jacob dies in 1880 and is buried in the Protestant zone, while Josefina dies in 1888 and is buried in the Catholic zone. The ban cannot be circumvented, so the 2 lovers were buried against the brick wall, and the height of the tombstones exceeded the height of the wall. And to taunt one last time the absurd sadness of the bans, a touching fantasy has been found to unite them despite everything. From the top of each of the tombstones emerges a carved hand, and the 2 hands clasped precisely above the wall. Love always triumphs over adversity, and even in death, its ingenuity prevails over the restrictive smallness of society. Forest Lawn Memorial Park may ring a bell. It's where great American personalities are buried, like Michael Jackson, Ronald Reagan, and Walter Disney and many others. What makes this cemetery so prestigious is its location. Indeed, this cemetery is surrounded by the biggest American film studios, Universal, Walt Disney and Warner Brothers. Founded at the beginning of the 20th century, this cemetery is home to more than 119,000 graves and is not only a place where stars are buried, it is a historically important cultural site and contains sumptuous artistic monuments. Hubert Learight Eaton, the businessman who founded the site, wanted to create a joyful cemetery where weddings, the kind of ceremonies that would inspire cheerfulness, would be celebrated. Yes, Hubert had little taste for classic cemeteries, which he found dull and desolate. He was convinced that life after death would be a long stay of peace and joy. And this belief is reflected in the cemetery he created, a huge, welcoming park where the lawns and fountains are charming, without macabre buildings and austere monuments. In fact, weddings are sometimes celebrated in the various chapels of the Forest Lawn Memorial Park. This is far from the creepy cemeteries known to be haunted. Now imagine a cemetery that would be like a vast gallery exhibiting naive art. You walk among the graves and see everywhere colorful wooden stelae, rich in color and composition, Real entertaining paintings, whose style is a mixture of naive art and Wallachian culture. This is what makes the joyful cemetery of Sapanta in Romania so special. These brightly colored stelae represent a moment in the life of the deceased, or the circumstances of his death. The tone of these illustrations is almost always humorous. It must be said in this connection that in the old Wallachian traditions, everything connected with death is joyful. Indeed, the funeral rites were celebrations, and the funeral was a time of laughter and merriment. In 1935, a Romanian sculptor, Stan Ioan Patras, created the first type of work that would later make him famous, a colorful epitaph on an oak cross in the Wallachian style. This invention pleased a lot, and today the Romanian cemetery is a true multicolored garden, containing more than 800 stelae with rich and abundant chiseling. The drawings on them seem to be made by children, and these stels, whose background is always blue, are rectangular and filled with strange geometrical figures. A short allegorical text is sometimes engraved below the drawing, and as you can imagine, it is usually a humorous word about the personality of the deceased. This cemetery is a major tourist attraction in the region, for sure. Visiting this place is not demoralizing, and we are very tempted to go there. The direction: the city of Sagada, in the Philippines, in a mountainous province where an area remains an ancient practice dating back 2,000 years. While it is quite easy for us to conceive that the dead should be buried, the indigenous peoples of Sagada have quite opposite visions. For them, burial has many disadvantages, so they hung their dead on the cliff sides or placed them in raised caves. This practice is still in use today, although Christian funeral rites are increasingly observed. But what is the origin of this custom? As you can imagine, there's a lot of superstition and myth. First, it was to shorten the distance between heaven and the deceased, but it was also to prevent dogs from devouring the remains, or desecrators from ransacking them. All in all, there is a double temporal and spiritual benefit, as you can see. In addition, the deceased, fixed high up in coffins they had made themselves, could always get some fresh air and a few rays of sunshine. However, this practice is expensive and requires time and a lot of effort. Only the rich receive this honor. When a wealthy inhabitant dies, he is first covered with cloth and attached to a wooden seat. After being carefully embalmed, he is placed at the threshold of the house in full view of all the neighbors who come to honor his memory. Then comes another singularity. As a symbol of rebirth, the deceased is placed in the fetal position in the coffin, which is no more than a meter long. The coffin is then raised using ropes until it reaches a suitable height. Unfortunately, the Sagada air cemeteries are doomed to disappear, like all marginal things in this world. The wood in these chests deteriorates due to rain and humidity, and coffins sometimes fall down. A cemetery that is dying, isn't it sadly ironic? The last coffin hanging was 10 years ago, and nowadays more coffins fall than rising. The Ekaterinburg Cemetery in Russia is unique in the world. Many members of the Russian mafia are buried there, among them the great leaders of organized crime. After the destruction of the USSR, the most powerful among them took advantage of the instability in the country and were considerably enriched. And in these charming circles, the display of wealth is the rule. The richest have found an excellent way to strike spirits even after death. If you visit this Ekaterinburg cemetery, you will see instead of simple grave markers, sculptures of luxury cars, oversized tombstones depicting the deceased with striking realism. In short, the portraits depict the deceased in his or her greatest day. And of course, no sign of wealth is left out. Gold chains, luxurious cars, and expensive costumes adorn these exorbitant tombs. Some are carved with cigarettes in hand, others in front of a table on which an empty wine bottle is placed. The truth is that excessiveness is everywhere in this cemetery. You will not find Christian humility and its symbols of pious aspirations towards heaven. Rather, you will see large portraits of megalomaniacs surrounded by luxury. In Australia, at Mount Macedon Cemetery, there is a beautiful and original sculpture, which arouses a deep feeling of tenderness. In 1987, Lawrence Matheson died at the age of 57, and his wife Christina, desperate, had the idea of expressing her grief in the most eloquent way possible, by using the art of statuary. What could be more beautiful and more expressive than a representation of eternal love on a grave? Christina asked the Australian sculptor Peter Schipperheyn to design work in Carrara marble for her, taking her as a model. This sculpture depicts Christina lying on the side and above the grave of her deceased husband. The right arm of asleep, that is the name of the work, is outstretched, drowned under the scattered hair, and the fingers nervously grasp the thickness of the tomb. We must admit that this sculpture is beautiful and moving. Moreover, many Australians come to visit the cemetery to admire it. Certainly, Christina could not better symbolize her unfailing love for Lawrence. That's it. That's the end of that video. Feel free to comment on which of these cemeteries made the strongest impression on you, and why.